The Montana Rangers radio crackled to life at 3:47 p.m., freezing Jackson Rivers mid-step as he poured coffee from his thermos. Massive python attacking White Horse Ranch. Thunder's down, repeat. The bull is down. His cup slipped from trembling fingers, ceramic shattering against the rocky ground. It wasn't just another animal rescue call. The coordinates led straight to his childhood home. Behind him, Ranger Marcus grabbed the wheel of their truck, engine roaring to life as dust clouds exploded around spinning tires. "Jesus Christ, Jackson, that snake's 18 feet if it's an inch." The radio screamed with overlapping voices, dispatch coordinates, medical units mobilizing. Jackson's weathered hands gripped the dashboard, remembering a 12-year-old boy who'd bottle-fed that same bull every morning before school. Thunder had been just a calf then, all knobby knees and gentle brown eyes, following him like a loyal dog across endless Montana grassland. "Move faster!" Jackson barked, his voice cracking with 20 years of buried emotion. Who was still alive at Whispering Pines Ranch, and why did his heart feel like it was breaking before they'd even arrived? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Whispering Pines Ranch stretched across 2,000 acres of Montana's most unforgiving yet beautiful terrain, where the Glacier National Park wilderness met generations of Whitehorse family sweat and dreams. For 12 years, this land had been home to an unlikely friendship that defied everything most folks understood about the relationship between man and beast. Ezra Whitehorse stood 65 years tall, with the weathered hands of a man who'd pulled calves in blizzards and mended fences under scorching summer suns. His Cherokee-Irish heritage showed in his steel-gray eyes and the patient way he moved through the world, like someone who understood that rushing rarely solved anything worth solving. Since his beloved wife Martha passed 3 years ago, leaving him with nothing but memories and an increasingly foggy mind, Ezra had found his truest companion in the most unexpected place. Thunder wasn't just any bull. At 12 years old and 1,200 pounds of pure Brahman muscle, he possessed an intelligence that unnerved visitors and comforted family. His coat shimmered silver gray in the Montana sunlight, and his gentle brown eyes held a depth that seemed almost human. Martha used to joke that Thunder understood English better than their neighbors' teenagers, and she wasn't far wrong. The massive bull responded to over 20 voice commands, could open gate latches with his massive head, and had an uncanny ability to sense when any living creature needed protection. 2 years ago, when 8-year-old Little Bear had wandered too close to a coiled rattlesnake during a family picnic, Thunder had positioned his enormous body between the child and danger, standing motionless as stone until Ezra could safely remove his grandson. That bull had more heart than most folks Ezra knew, and certainly more loyalty than his own son Tommy, who'd stormed off the ranch 20 years ago after a bitter fight about backward ranching ways and wasting his college education on cow manure. Sarah Whitehorse, Ezra's 40-year-old daughter, carried the weight of 3 generations on her shoulders. After her divorce 5 years ago, she'd given up a thriving veterinary practice in Denver to return home and help her aging father manage the ranch. Every morning, she watched her dad's mind slip a little further into the fog that doctors called early-stage Alzheimer's, though Ezra refused to acknowledge the diagnosis. She saw how he forgot simple things, where he'd left his tools, whether he'd fed the horses, sometimes even her name, but never forgot Thunder's feeding schedule or the exact way to scratch behind the bull's ears. Little Bear, Sarah's 8-year-old son, spent every afternoon after school perched on Thunder's broad back, chattering about his day in the way children do when they believe the whole world is listening. The boy had named the bull after a thunderstorm the night he was born, claiming the tiny calf's first moo sounded like distant thunder rolling across the prairie. Now, 12 years later, that same thunder had become the steadiest heartbeat in all their lives. None of them knew that 45 miles away, a man named Jackson Rivers was racing toward them, carrying 20 years of regret and a badge that said Montana Park Ranger, when his real name was Tommy Whitehorse. The emergency call came through Glacier County Dispatch at exactly 3:30 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Caleb Morrison, whose property bordered the Whitehorse Ranch, had been checking his fence line when he heard what he later described as the sound of the earth itself groaning in pain. His weathered hands shook as he dialed 911, his voice cracking with the kind of fear that comes from witnessing something that shouldn't exist in the natural order of things. "Biggest damn snake I ever seen," Caleb stammered into his phone, binoculars still pressed to his eyes as he watched the scene unfold across the valley. "Must be 18, maybe 20 feet long. Got Ezra's prize bull wrapped up tighter than barbed wire. And Ezra? Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Ezra's down too. Looks like he collapsed right there next to Thunder. You need to get somebody out here now." The dispatcher's fingers flew across her keyboard as she took down the details. Whispering Pines Ranch. 2 victims, possible heart attack, dangerous wildlife situation requiring immediate response. Within minutes, the call had been routed to Montana Park Rangers, the nearest medical unit, and the volunteer fire department. But it was Jackson Rivers who grabbed the radio first, his coffee cup hitting the ground before the transmission even finished. "Unit 7 responding." Jackson's voice cut through the static, though something in his tone made his partner Marcus look twice. "ETA 15 minutes. Dispatch medical helicopter to the coordinates and get me everything we know about Burmese python behavior in cold weather." As Jackson's team raced across the Montana plains, dust clouds billowing behind their emergency vehicles, 45 miles away, Sarah Whitehorse was finishing her last appointment at the Glacier Valley Veterinary Clinic. She'd been treating a border collie with hip dysplasia when her phone started buzzing with missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The first voicemail made her blood run cold. "Sarah, this is dispatch. We've got an emergency at your father's ranch. Multiple units responding. You need to get there as soon as possible." She was in her truck before the message finished playing, her veterinary bag forgotten on the clinic counter as she pressed the accelerator toward the floor. The 45-minute drive stretched ahead like an eternity, and with every mile her mind conjured worse scenarios. Dad's heart, his increasingly frequent dizzy spells, the way he'd been forgetting things, important things, like whether he'd taken his medication or locked the gates at night. Meanwhile, Little Bear sat in his 3rd-grade classroom at Glacier Elementary, completely unaware that his entire world was about to change. Mrs. Henderson was teaching fractions when the principal appeared in the doorway with that particular expression adults get when they're trying to figure out how to tell a child something terrible. Little Bear would remember later how the autumn sunlight was streaming through the classroom windows, how Jessica Parker was braiding her hair, how normal everything felt in the moment before normal ended forever. Back at the ranch, Ezra Whitehorse lay semi-conscious in the autumn grass, his body having finally succumbed to the stress his mind had been fighting for months. In his confused state, fragments of memories mixed with present reality like pieces of a puzzle scattered by a strong wind. He kept mumbling the same words over and over. "Forgive me. Forgive me. Too late. Too late." His weathered hand reached toward where Thunder lay motionless, the massive bull's form unnaturally still in the afternoon light. The approaching storm system added urgency to every emergency responder's calculations. Weather reports showed a major front moving in from the west, bringing with it the kind of Montana weather that could ground helicopters and make backcountry rescues impossible. They had perhaps 2 hours of good weather left, maybe less if the wind picked up earlier than predicted. Jackson's radio crackled with updates as his convoy closed the distance. "Unit 7, be advised we're getting conflicting reports on the scene. Witness says the bull appears to be under attack, but there's been no movement visible for the last 15 minutes. Recommend extreme caution on approach." "Copy that." Jackson replied, though something about the whole situation felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. His 20 years of ranger experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming that this wasn't a straightforward animal attack. The convoy of emergency vehicles crested the final hill at 3:47 p.m., and Jackson Rivers felt his world tilt sideways as the Whispering Pines Ranch spread out below them like a living photograph from his childhood. The red barn still needed paint on its north side. The split-rail fence still zigzagged along the creek bottom exactly as he remembered. Even the old oak tree where he'd built his first treehouse stood sentinel over the homestead, its autumn leaves catching the afternoon light like scattered gold coins. But it was the two motionless forms in the pasture that commanded every ounce of his attention now. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered from the passenger seat, binoculars pressed to his eyes. "That snake's got to be 18 feet if it's an inch. Look at the size of that bull it's wrapped around." Jackson's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. Even from a quarter-mile away he could see the distinctive silver-gray coat and massive frame that could only belong to a prize Brahman bull. Thunder. The name came to him unbidden, along with a rush of memories he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. A gangly calf following him around the ranch like a devoted dog. Martha Whitehorse laughing as she watched the bull calf try to fit through a gate that was clearly too small. His father's voice calling across the pasture, "Tommy, that bull's got more sense than you do, boy." "Jackson, you okay?" Elena Rodriguez, their team's medical specialist, was studying his face with professional concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He wanted to tell her that maybe he had. Instead, he forced his voice to remain steady and professional. "Team, listen up. We've got a complex situation here. 2 victims, elderly, male, human, massive bull, both down. One Burmese python, approximately 18 feet, appears to have both victims in its coils. Weather window is closing fast." The team began their methodical approach, following protocols Jackson had helped write for dangerous wildlife encounters. David Chen and Rebecca Martinez took the flanking positions with tranquilizer equipment, while Marcus radioed for additional medical support. Elena prepped her trauma kit, her movements quick and efficient despite the unprecedented nature of their call. But as they drew closer, Jackson's 20 years of experience in the Montana wilderness began sending up red flags. The scene was too quiet, too still. In every python attack he'd studied or responded to, there was movement, the constant, methodical tightening of coils, the python repositioning for better leverage, the victim struggling against the constriction. Here, everything looked frozen in time, like a macabre tableau arranged by some cosmic photographer. A constriction takes time, even with prey this size. And look at the python. When was the last time you saw an 18-foot Burmese just lying there like a garden hose? They're ambush predators, but they're also constantly alert for threats. Marcus was already thinking ahead to the tactical implications. So what are we looking at? Scavenger behavior. Python found the bull already dead and was... what? Feeding? Jackson was about to respond when Ezra Whitehorse's voice carried across the autumn air, weak but audible in the prairie stillness. "Forgive me," the old man was saying over and over. "Too late, too late. Should have done it sooner." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. That voice, weathered by decades of Montana winters, roughened by a lifetime of calling cattle across vast pastures, was exactly as he remembered it. Maybe a little weaker now, a little more fragile, but unmistakably his father's voice. The same voice that had sung him to sleep as a child, taught him to rope and brand, and eventually told him to get off the ranch and never come back if he thought he was too good for the family business. "Jackson?" Elena's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You with us?" He shook himself back to the present moment, forcing his emotions into the mental box where he'd kept them locked for 20 years. "Sorry," Altitude adjustment. Let's move in slow and careful. David, keep that tranq gun ready, but don't use it unless the python shows aggressive behavior. Elena, be prepared for possible cardiac event in the human victim. Rebecca, document everything. This scene's going to need careful analysis. As they approached, more details became clear. Ezra was conscious but disoriented, his eyes moving between the dead bull and the unmoving python, with confusion that seemed to go deeper than just trauma. His clothes were disheveled, and there was something clutched in his right hand, something small and metallic that caught the afternoon light. The python, meanwhile, remained absolutely motionless. Its massive coils were wrapped around Thunder's body, but there was no tension in them, no sense of active constriction. If Jackson didn't know better, he'd say the serpent looked almost protective, like it was guarding the bull rather than consuming it. "This doesn't make sense," Elena murmured as they reached the edge of the scene. "None of this makes sense." Jackson knelt beside his father, though Ezra showed no sign of recognizing him, and gently took the old man's pulse, strong but rapid, indicating shock rather than cardiac arrest. "Sir, can you hear me? Can you tell me what happened here?" Ezra's eyes focused on Jackson's face with difficulty, and for one heart-stopping moment, Jackson thought he saw a flicker of recognition. The discovery of the empty syringe changed everything. Jackson's mind raced through the implications as Elena began her medical assessment of Ezra, who continued to mumble his confused apologies to the autumn sky. The python hadn't moved so much as an inch since their arrival, and Thunder's massive body showed the telltale signs of rigor mortis beginning to set in around the edges, a process that took hours, not minutes. "David, I need you to approach that python very slowly," Jackson commanded, his voice tight with a growing suspicion he didn't want to voice. "Check for vital signs. Don't touch it. Just observe." David Chen had been working with dangerous wildlife for 8 years, and he'd never seen a Burmese python behave like this. As he circled the massive serpent, his trained eye caught details that made his stomach clench. "Jackson, I'm not seeing any breathing patterns. No movement in the coils. And," he paused, leaning closer, "there's some kind of puncture wound near the head, small, precise, like it was injected with something." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with horrible clarity. Jackson looked down at his father, and the word father felt strange in his mind after 20 years of calling him the victim or the rancher, and saw not just confusion in those familiar steel-gray eyes, but guilt, deep soul-crushing guilt that seemed to age the man even as Jackson watched. "Sir," Jackson said gently, crouching beside Ezra, "I need you to try to focus. Can you tell me about the syringe? What was in it?" Ezra's weathered hand trembled as he looked at the empty syringe he'd been clutching. Had to end it. The cancer was eating him alive. 3 months, maybe less. Sarah said he was suffering. His voice broke completely. "But then that damn snake showed up, and I thought maybe—" Elena looked up from her examination, her face pale. "Jackson, Mr. Whitehorse is showing signs of severe psychological trauma, but his vitals are stable. However, if what he's saying is true—" "We're looking at a mercy killing," Jackson finished, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "Both animals. The bull was dying of cancer, and someone, probably a veterinarian, ended his suffering. Then a python, probably an escaped pet or illegal import, found the carcass and was scavenging when someone put it down too." The sound of approaching vehicles made them all turn. A white pickup truck was racing down the ranch road, dust billowing behind it like a storm cloud. Even from a distance, Jackson could see the driver was pushing the vehicle far beyond safe speeds for the winding dirt road. "That'll be family," Marcus observed. Should we secure the scene first? Jackson was about to respond when his father grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Up close, Ezra's eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there moments before, as if the trauma had temporarily cleared the fog that had been clouding his mind for months. "I know you," Ezra whispered, his voice barely audible above the approaching truck. "You've got your mother's hands. Same long fingers. Same way of holding things gentle-like." His grip tightened. "Tommy, my boy, is that really you?" The recognition hit Jackson like a physical blow. 20 years of carefully constructed distance, 20 years of telling himself he was Jackson Rivers the ranger, not Tommy Whitehorse the rancher's son, crumbled in an instant. "Dad," he whispered back, the word coming out strangled and raw. But before either of them could say more, the white pickup skidded to a stop and Sarah Whitehorse burst out, her veterinary bag in one hand and her face etched with the kind of panic only family members understand. She took in the scene at a glance, her father on the ground, Thunder's motionless form, the massive python, and 5 strangers in ranger uniforms, and her knees nearly buckled. "Oh God! Oh God! What happened?" She rushed toward Ezra, then stopped short when she saw the syringe in his hand. The color drained from her face completely. "Dad, what did you do?" "Ma'am, I'm Ranger Rivers," Jackson said, standing and moving to intercept her before she could contaminate what was rapidly becoming a crime scene. "Your father is stable, but we need to understand what happened here. Are you Dr. Sarah Whitehorse, the veterinarian?" Sarah's eyes darted between the syringe, her father's guilty expression, and Thunder's still form. Yes, I'm Dr. Whitehorse." "But I don't understand. Thunder was sick, yes, but we hadn't made any decisions yet about—" She stopped mid-sentence as the full implication hit her. "You think Dad euthanized Thunder? Here? By himself?" Elena stepped forward with her medical bag. "Dr. Whitehorse, we found your father conscious but disoriented, holding an empty syringe. Both the bull and the python appear to have been dead for several hours. We need to understand the sequence of events." "The python?" Sarah looked at the massive serpent for the first time, her veterinary training taking over despite her emotional state. "Where did that come from? We don't have Burmese pythons in Montana. They can't survive our winters." "Escaped exotic pet, most likely," David answered, "probably drawn to Thunder's scent. Found him already deceased and was scavenging when someone put it down too." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, horror, understanding, and finally a terrible kind of relief mixed with grief. She knelt beside her father, taking his hand gently. "Dad, honey, what were you trying to do?" Ezra's moment of clarity was fading, the fog returning to his eyes, but he managed to squeeze his daughter's hand. "Thunder was hurtin', baby girl. You said the cancer was in his bones, that he couldn't hardly walk no more. I watched him this morning trying to get up to eat, and he looked at me like he was asking for help. But Dad, euthanasia requires proper procedures, documentation. You can't just—" "I know that." Ezra's voice flared with sudden anger, then immediately softened. "I ain't stupid, Sarah. But I also ain't gonna watch that bull suffer one more day while we debate the proper paperwork. He's been my companion for 12 years. "I'm sorry, but that's protocol for any unexplained death involving controlled substances." "Crime scene?" Sarah's voice rose. "This is our home. Thunder was part of our family, and that python was obviously someone's illegal pet that shouldn't have been here in the first place." "I understand your emotions, ma'am," Jackson said, though his own emotions were churning in ways that made it hard to maintain professional distance. "But we have 2 dead animals, controlled substances, and questions about proper authorization, until we can establish the facts." "The facts?" Sarah stood up, her grief transforming into anger. "The fact is that my father has been losing his memory for months. The fact is that Thunder had terminal bone cancer and was in constant pain. The fact is that we were going to have to make this decision anyway, but Dad couldn't bear to wait for the proper procedures while watching his best friend suffer." Her words struck Jackson with unexpected force. He looked down at his father not just a victim in a case, and saw not a criminal, but an old man who'd made an impossible choice out of love, the same kind of stubborn, fierce love that had defined the Whitehorse family for generations. But before anyone could respond, the sound of a school bus approaching made them all turn. Little Bear would be coming home to find his world completely changed, and none of them were prepared to explain why Thunder would never again be waiting by the gate to greet him. The investigation was just beginning, but Jackson already knew that the hardest questions wouldn't be about veterinary protocols or controlled substances. They would be about the price of love, the burden of mercy, and whether doing the right thing was always the same as doing the legal thing. The yellow school bus rounded the bend just as Jackson was radioing for additional units, and the sight of it made everyone freeze. Little Bear would be getting off that bus in less than 2 minutes, expecting to run straight to Thunder's pasture for their daily after-school ritual. The boy had no idea that his best friend lay dead in the grass, or that his grandfather was about to be questioned in what might become a criminal investigation. "Sarah," Jackson said quickly, "you need to intercept your son before he sees this scene. Can you meet the bus at the road?" But it was too late. The bus had already stopped at the ranch gate, and Little Bear was bounding down the steps with his backpack bouncing against his small frame. Even from a distance they could see him scanning the pasture for Thunder's familiar form, his 8-year-old mind not yet processing why there were so many strange vehicles in his driveway. "Grandpa Ezra," Little Bear called out, starting to run toward the group. "Is Thunder okay? Why is everyone here?" Sarah caught her son before he could get close enough to see the details of the scene, scooping him into her arms despite his protests. "Honey, we need to talk. Something's happened to Thunder. Is he sick? Did you have to give him medicine?" Little Bear's voice was already edged with the kind of fear children develop when adults start using their careful voices. "Mom, why won't you let me see him?" The raw innocence in the boy's questions cut through Jackson like a blade. He watched Sarah struggle to find words that could possibly make sense of this situation to a child, and felt his professional detachment cracking under the weight of family dynamics he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Elena stepped forward with the gentle authority that made her so effective with trauma victims. "Little Bear, that's your name, right? I'm Elena, and I'm here to help. Sometimes grown-ups have to make very hard decisions about animals when they're hurting. Do you understand? Thunder was hurting?" Little Bear's eyes went wide. "But he was fine yesterday. He ate his apples, and we played the game where he pushes the ball with his nose, and he let me braid flowers in his tail." Ezra's voice cracked from where he lay in the grass. "Come here, little man. Grandpa needs to tell you something important." Sarah hesitated, clearly torn between protecting her son from trauma and allowing her father this potentially final conversation with his grandson. Jackson found himself stepping forward, though he had no official reason to interfere in the family's decision. "Maybe we should let them talk," he said quietly to Sarah. "Your father's lucid right now, and kids sometimes understand things better than we think they do." Sarah studied Jackson's face with new attention, as if hearing something familiar in his voice. "You're not just any ranger, are you? You know this place. You know us." Before Jackson could answer, Little Bear had wriggled free from his mother's arms and run to kneel beside his grandfather. The boy's small hand found Ezra's weathered one, and the sight of their joined hands, 8 years old and 65, 2 generations connected by love and loss, made Jackson's throat tighten with emotions he'd thought were long buried. "Grandpa, why is Thunder sleeping in the grass? He never sleeps there. He always sleeps in the barn when it's cold." Ezra's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "Thunder isn't sleeping, little man. Thunder's gone to where Grandma Martha went, to the place where nothing hurts anymore." "You mean he's dead?" Little Bear's voice was matter-of-fact in the way children's voices can be when dealing with concepts too large for their understanding. "Like my goldfish Larry?" "Yes, son, like Larry. But why?" "Thunder was strong. Thunder was the strongest bull in all of Montana." Ezra glanced toward Sarah, seeking permission for a conversation no grandfather should have to have. She nodded reluctantly, tears streaming down her face. "Thunder was sick inside, where we couldn't see it. The sickness was making him hurt all the time, and it was going to get worse. So I helped him go to sleep forever so he wouldn't hurt any more." Little Bear processed this information with the serious concentration children bring to life-changing moments. "Like when Dr. Martinez helped Larry go to sleep when he got sick?" "Yes, exactly like that." "But why is the big snake here? Did the snake hurt Thunder?" Jackson knelt beside the boy, his ranger training taking over even as his heart ached. "No, son. The snake found Thunder after he was already gone. Sometimes wild animals do that." "The snake didn't hurt Thunder, and Thunder didn't suffer." Little Bear looked up at Jackson with eyes that were disturbingly wise for an 8-year-old. "Are you going to take Grandpa away, like they did to Bobby Miller's dad when he did something wrong?" The question hit Jackson like a physical blow. Bobby Miller's father had been arrested for domestic violence 3 months ago, and apparently the story had made its way through the third-grade grapevine. Little Bear was asking, with heartbreaking directness, whether his grandfather was going to jail. Jackson started, then stopped. The truth was, he didn't know. Montana law was clear about controlled substances and unauthorized euthanasia, but it was also clear about prosecutorial discretion and extenuating circumstances. An elderly man with dementia making a mercy decision about his own animal fell into a gray area that would ultimately be decided by people who'd never spent a day on a ranch. Sarah saved him from having to answer. "Nobody's taking Grandpa anywhere today, sweetheart. Right now, we need to say goodbye to Thunder properly." As if summoned by her words, more vehicles began arriving. The county coroner's van, followed by what Jackson recognized as the state veterinarian's truck, and finally a news van that made everyone groan collectively. Someone had been monitoring the emergency frequencies, and the story of a massive python attacking a prize bull was apparently too good for the local media to ignore. "Damn it," Marcus muttered. "Last thing we need is reporters turning this into a circus." But Jackson was focused on something else entirely. As the various officials began arriving and taking control of the scene, he watched his father's face cycle through confusion, clarity, and fear. Ezra Whitehorse had lived his entire life on this ranch, following rules he understood and maintaining a relationship with the land that went back generations. Now he was surrounded by strangers with clipboards and cameras, people who would reduce Thunder's death to paperwork and legal precedents. The state veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Fernandez, approached Sarah with professional sympathy. "Dr. Whitehorse, I'm sorry for your loss, but I need to examine both animals and determine cause of death. Can you walk me through what you know about the situation?" Sarah's answer was carefully measured. Thunder had been diagnosed with terminal bone cancer approximately 6 weeks ago. The prognosis was 3 to 4 months, with increasing pain and mobility issues. We had been discussing end-of-life options. And the python? I have no idea where it came from. Burmese pythons aren't native to Montana and couldn't survive our winters naturally. Dr. Fernandez made notes on her tablet. The preliminary examination suggests both animals were euthanized with pentobarbital or a similar agent. That would require veterinary authorization and proper documentation. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah had the training, access, and legal authority to euthanize Thunder. Ezra had the motive and opportunity, but not the legal right. Someone was going to have to take responsibility for what had happened, and that someone was likely going to face serious consequences. Jackson found himself making a decision that would have shocked his younger self. "Dr. Fernandez, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" As they stepped away from the group, Jackson's mind raced through possibilities. He was about to cross a line that could end his career, but watching Little Bear hold his grandfather's hand while reporters set up their cameras, he realized there were things more important than career advancement. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, if an elderly man with early-stage dementia found his longtime companion animal in severe pain from terminal cancer, and if that man had access to euthanasia drugs through a family member who was a licensed veterinarian, would the act of ending that animal's suffering be considered criminal intent or compassionate mercy?" Dr. Fernandez studied Jackson's face carefully. "That would depend on a number of factors, Ranger Rivers. The animal's condition, the availability of legal alternatives, the mental capacity of the person making the decision, and the specific circumstances surrounding the act. And if that same elderly man then encountered an invasive python species that posed a potential threat to other livestock or wildlife, would putting that animal down be considered appropriate wildlife management? Again, that would depend on the specific circumstances and the person's authority to make such decisions." Jackson nodded slowly. "Then I think we need to be very careful about how we document this incident. The last thing Montana needs is a precedent that criminalizes ranchers for making compassionate decisions about their own animals." Dr. Fernandez's expression suggested she understood exactly what Jackson was really asking. The question was whether she was willing to help him protect a family that was already breaking apart under the weight of age, illness, and impossible choices. In the distance, Little Bear was picking wildflowers and placing them on Thunder's still form, his small voice carrying across the pasture as he sang a lullaby his great-grandmother had once sung to Ezra. It was a sound that belonged to this land, to this family, to a way of life that was disappearing one ranch at a time. Jackson looked at his father, his sister, his nephew, and realized that some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant risking everything he'd built for himself as Jackson Rivers, the Ranger. The investigation was about to take a very different turn. The news van's presence transformed what had been a family tragedy into a public spectacle, and Jackson watched with growing dread as reporter Jennifer Walsh began setting up for what would undoubtedly become the lead story on the evening news. "Massive python kills prize bull, elderly rancher hospitalized" would be the headline, he was certain, and the truth would be buried under sensationalism and speculation. Dr. Fernandez completed her preliminary examination of both animals while the cameras rolled from a respectful distance, but Jackson could see the concern growing in her professional demeanor. The evidence was becoming increasingly clear, and none of it supported the python attack narrative that everyone had initially assumed. "Ranger Rivers," she called him over quietly, "I need to show you something." They walked to where Thunder's massive form lay in the afternoon grass, the Burmese python's coils still wrapped around the bull's torso. Up close, the scene told a story that Jackson's 20 years of experience could read like a book, and it wasn't the story anyone wanted to hear. "Look at the injection sites." Dr. Fernandez pointed to two small puncture wounds, one on Thunder's neck and another on the python's head. Both are consistent with large-gauge veterinary needles. Both show signs of recent administration within the last 6 to 8 hours. But here's what's interesting. The python was injected after it was already in position around the bull. Jackson felt his stomach drop. Meaning? Meaning, the python found Thunder already dead, began scavenging as these animals do, And then someone came along and euthanized the python while it was feeding. This wasn't a rescue attempt. This was cleanup. The implications crashed over Jackson like a cold wave. Someone had deliberately killed Thunder, then killed the python to cover their tracks or eliminate a witness. The question was whether that someone was his confused, grief-stricken father or someone else entirely. "Dr. Fernandez?" Sarah's voice came from behind them, tight with emotion. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have said from the beginning." Jackson turned to see his sister approaching, her face pale but resolute. Little Bear was still by Ezra's side, singing softly to his grandfather, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around him. "I euthanized Thunder this morning at 6:30 a.m., Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad didn't do it. I did." The confession hung in the air like a physical thing, changing the entire dynamic of the investigation. Jackson felt his world shift again, realizing that his sister, the little girl he'd taught to rope and ride, was confessing to what might be considered illegal practice of veterinary medicine. "Sarah, stop talking," Jackson said urgently. "You need a lawyer before you say anything else." "No," she replied firmly. "I'm tired of lies. I'm tired of watching Dad torture himself with guilt over something I did." She turned to Dr. Fernandez. Thunder had terminal osteosarcoma, bone cancer, advanced stage. He had maybe 6 weeks left, and every day was agony for him. He could barely stand, couldn't graze normally, was losing weight rapidly. Dr. Fernandez nodded professionally. "That would be consistent with what I'm seeing in the examination. But Dr. Whitehorse, you know that large animal euthanasia requires proper documentation, witness protocols, and disposal procedures." "I know," Sarah's voice broke. "But I also knew that if we went through official channels, there would be delays, inspections, questions about Dad's mental state. The state might have declared him unfit to make decisions about his own animals. They might have taken the ranch away from him." Jackson understood immediately. Montana had been cracking down on elderly ranchers with cognitive decline after several high-profile cases of animal neglect. If authorities had gotten involved in Thunder's care, they would have inevitably discovered Ezra's Alzheimer's symptoms, and the family would have faced a cascade of legal and financial consequences. "So you did it quietly," Dr. Fernandez said without judgment, "at dawn when your father was still sleeping." "I thought I did," Sarah continued, tears flowing freely now. "I used a sedative first, then the pentobarbital. Thunder went peacefully, I'm certain of that. But when I came back with the truck to transport his body for cremation, Dad was already here. He'd found Thunder and he was talking to him like he was still alive." The tragedy of the situation was becoming clear. Ezra, in his confused state, had discovered Thunder's body and assumed his beloved companion was sleeping. In his deteriorating mental condition, he'd convinced himself that Thunder was still alive but suffering, and that he needed to help him. "Dad didn't understand that Thunder was already gone," Sarah continued. "He kept saying Thunder was in pain, that he needed to end his suffering. That's when he must have found my veterinary bag in the truck. He gave Thunder another injection, not realizing Thunder was already dead," Jackson finished. The unnecessary second injection explained why Ezra had been found holding an empty syringe, consumed with guilt over what he thought he'd done. "But what about the python?" Dr. Fernandez asked. Sarah's face grew even paler. "I found Dad here around noon trying to wake Thunder up. The python had It had found the body and was beginning to feed. Dad was terrified, thought the snake had killed Thunder. Before I could stop him, he grabbed another syringe from my bag and injected the python." The complete picture finally emerged. Sarah had euthanized Thunder humanely at dawn. Ezra, discovering the body hours later in his confused state, had tried to help Thunder and then protect him from the scavenging python. 3 injections total, 1 merciful, 2 tragic. "Sarah," Dr. Fernandez said gently, "why didn't you tell us this immediately?" "Because I saw Dad's face when you all arrived. He was so convinced he'd killed Thunder, and I thought maybe it would be easier for everyone if we just let him believe it was the python. But watching him torture himself with guilt." She looked over at her father, who was now holding Little Bear and staring at nothing. "I can't let him carry that burden for something I did." Jackson felt a surge of pride in his sister, mixed with terror at what her confession might mean legally. "Sarah, do you understand what you're admitting to? Unauthorized euthanasia of livestock, improper disposal procedures, failure to report." "I understand that I'm a veterinarian who couldn't bear to watch an animal suffer," she replied firmly. "And I understand that I'm a daughter who couldn't watch her father's heart break every day, knowing Thunder was dying by inches." The sound of another vehicle approaching made them all turn. This time it was the sheriff's department, responding to the news reports and the complexity of the situation. Sheriff Robert Hayes, no relation to the neighbor who'd called in the emergency, stepped out of his cruiser with the weary expression of a man who'd dealt with too many family tragedies. "Folks," Sheriff Hayes announced, "I'm going to need to speak with everyone involved here. We've got controlled substances, unlicensed animal disposal, and what might be considered destruction of evidence. This is officially a criminal investigation now." Little Bear looked up from his grandfather's side, his 8-year-old mind struggling to process words like criminal investigation and controlled substances in the context of his family. "Mom," he called out in a small voice, "are you in trouble because Thunder was sick?" The innocence of the question, the pure lack of understanding that love and mercy could be considered crimes, broke something inside Jackson. He looked at his nephew, this boy he'd never known existed until an hour ago, and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. "Sheriff Hayes," Jackson said, stepping forward with his ranger credentials visible, "I think there might be some confusion about the sequence of events here. Perhaps we should discuss this privately before making any official determinations." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd known Jackson for years through various interagency cooperations, and he could hear something in the ranger's voice that suggested this conversation was going to be more complicated than anyone anticipated. "Ranger Rivers, are you suggesting there's more to this situation than what's apparent?" Jackson looked at his father, his sister, his nephew, and the dead animals that had started this whole tragedy. Then he looked at the reporters, the officials, the strangers who would reduce his family's pain to paperwork and precedent. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I'm suggesting that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing." Sheriff Hayes agreed to move the conversation away from the cameras and curious onlookers, and the core group gathered in the shadow of the old red barn where Jackson had spent countless childhood hours learning to work with his hands and understand the rhythm of ranch life. The irony wasn't lost on him that this might be where his family's secrets were finally revealed, 20 years after he'd walked away from everything this barn represented. "All right, folks," Sheriff Hayes began, pulling out his notepad with the methodical care of a man who'd learned that details mattered in court. "Let's start from the beginning. Dr. Whitehorse, you've confessed to euthanizing the bull this morning without proper documentation. That's a serious matter involving controlled substances and livestock regulations." Sarah nodded, her jaw set with the same stubborn determination Jackson remembered from their childhood arguments. "Yes, sir. I take full responsibility for that decision." "And Mr. Whitehorse," the sheriff continued, looking at Ezra with professional sympathy, "you administered a second injection to an already deceased animal, believing you were ending its suffering?" Ezra's confusion was evident as he struggled to follow the conversation. "Thunder was hurting," he said simply. "I couldn't let him hurt." "Dad," Sarah said gently, Thunder wasn't hurting anymore. I had already helped him pass peacefully. You were trying to protect him because you love him, but he was already at rest." The words seemed to penetrate Ezra's foggy understanding, and Jackson watched his father's face cycle through confusion, comprehension, and a grief so profound it was painful to witness. "You mean, Thunder wasn't suffering when I found him?" "No, Dad. He was already free from pain." Dr. Fernandez stepped forward with her official report. "Sheriff, based on my examination, I can confirm that the first injection was professionally administered and would have resulted in peaceful, painless death. The second injection was unnecessary but not harmful, administered to an already deceased animal. The third injection, to the python, appears to have been defensive in nature." Sheriff Hayes made careful notes, but Jackson could see him struggling with the human elements of a situation that didn't fit neatly into legal categories. "The problem we have here is that controlled substances were used without proper authorization and documentation. Regardless of the motivation, that's a felony under Montana law." "Sheriff," Jackson said, knowing he was about to cross a line that could end his career, "I'd like to request a private conversation with you about the specifics of this case." Hayes studied Jackson's face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read people's intentions. "Ranger Rivers, are you speaking in your official capacity or as someone personally invested in this situation?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Jackson realized that everyone present was waiting for his answer. Sarah was looking at him with desperate hope. Ezra was watching with the confused awareness of someone trying to place a familiar face. Little Bear was sitting quietly beside his grandfather, somehow understanding that the adults were deciding something important about their family's future. "I'm speaking as Tommy Whitehorse," Jackson said finally, using his birth name for the first time in 20 years. "Ezra's son, Sarah's brother, Little Bear's uncle." The revelation sent shockwaves through the group. "Doctor." Fernandez raised her eyebrows, understanding immediately why Jackson had seemed so emotionally invested in the case. Sheriff Hayes nodded slowly, pieces of old gossip and half-remembered stories falling into place. "Well, I'll be damned," Hayes said quietly. "Tommy Whitehorse? Haven't heard that name in 20 years. Folks said you died in a climbing accident up in Glacier." "I let them think that," Jackson replied. "It was easier than explaining why I'd changed my name and never came home." Sarah was staring at her brother with a mixture of joy, anger, and disbelief. "You've been in Montana this whole time? You've been Jackson Rivers, the ranger we see on the news? And you never contacted us? Even when Mom died?" The accusation hit Jackson like a physical blow. "I didn't know Mom had passed. I was working a fire up in the Bitterroot Mountains. By the time I heard—" He stopped, realizing how hollow the excuse sounded even to himself. "Bullshit," Sarah said with surprising vehemence, her veterinarian's composure finally cracking. "You didn't know because you chose not to know. You could have called. You could have written. You could have come home for Christmas or Dad's birthday or any of the 1,000 times we needed you." Little Bear looked up from his grandfather's side, processing this new information with 8-year-old directness. "Mom? Uncle Tommy came back to help Thunder?" The innocence of the question cut through the adult recriminations like a knife. Jackson knelt down to Little Bear's eye level, seeing Martha's gentle features in the boy's face, mixed with the stubborn Whitehorse jawline that had defined their family for generations. "I came back too late to help Thunder, little man," Jackson said honestly. "But maybe I'm not too late to help the rest of our family." Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat, bringing the conversation back to the legal realities they were facing. "This is all very touching, but we still have the matter of controlled substances and unauthorized euthanasia." "And the python? Invasive species, potential threat to livestock and native wildlife. Any Montana rancher would have the right to eliminate such a threat on their own property." You're stretching the interpretation pretty thin, Tommy. Am I? Jackson stood, feeling the weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. Or am I applying common sense to a situation that the law never anticipated? Look around, Sheriff. This is a family dealing with terminal illness. Both the bull's cancer and Dad's Alzheimer's. They made difficult decisions based on love and mercy, not criminal intent. Sarah was watching her brother with growing amazement. Tommy, you could lose your job for this. Why are you taking this risk for us? Jackson looked at his father, who was holding Little Bear and staring at Thunder's distant form with the quiet dignity of a man who'd spent his life caring for the land and the animals that depended on him. He thought about the 20 years he'd spent running from this place, this family, this responsibility. Because I've been a coward long enough, he said simply. And because Thunder deserved better than to become evidence in a criminal case. He was family. Dr. Fernandez closed her report folder with a decisive snap. Sheriff, in my professional opinion, this was a case of compassionate euthanasia performed by a licensed veterinarian on her own family's animal. The subsequent actions by Mr. Whitehorse and the elimination of the invasive python species were within the scope of reasonable livestock management. Hayes looked between the official report, the family dynamics, and the practical realities of prosecuting an elderly man with dementia and his veterinarian daughter for trying to end an animal's suffering. Dr. Fernandez, you're willing to sign off on that interpretation? I am. And Ranger Rivers. Sorry, Whitehorse. You understand that if this goes sideways, your career is over? Jackson looked at Little Bear, who was still singing softly to his grandfather, and at Sarah, who was watching him with tears in her eyes, and at his father, who might not remember this conversation tomorrow, but who had never stopped loving the animals in his care. Sheriff, Jackson said, some things are more important than careers. The sound of reporters calling questions from beyond the barn reminded them all that this decision would be made in the public eye, subject to scrutiny and second-guessing. But for the first time in hours, Jackson felt something that had been missing from his life for 20 years, the certainty that he was doing the right thing, regardless of the consequences. All right, Sheriff Hayes said finally, putting away his notepad. I'm going to recommend to the prosecutor that this case be handled as a livestock management issue rather than a criminal matter. Dr. Whitehorse will need to file the proper documentation retroactively, and Mr. Whitehorse will need a cognitive evaluation. But I don't see any benefit to the state of Montana in prosecuting this family. The relief that washed over Sarah's face was visible, but Jackson knew their problems were far from over. The media attention, the questions about Ezra's fitness to manage the ranch, the financial pressures that had been building for months, none of that had changed. But for the first time in 20 years, the Whitehorse family was together again, facing their problems as a unit rather than struggling alone. Thunder's final gift to them all might have been bringing them back together. 3 days later, the Whispering Pines Ranch was quiet except for the sound of hammers and saws as neighbors arrived to help build Thunder's memorial. It was a Montana tradition that Jackson had forgotten during his 20 years away. When tragedy struck a ranching family, the community responded with practical love expressed through calloused hands and shared labor. Caleb Morrison, the neighbor who'd made the original emergency call, arrived at dawn with a truckload of cedar planks and his teenage grandson. Figured Thunder deserved something that would last, he said simply, unloading lumber near the hill where they'd chosen to bury the great bull. Cedar don't rot, and it smells good in the rain. Jackson stood on the front porch of the house where he'd grown up, holding a cup of coffee and watching his community, he realized with surprise, come together for his family. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, reminding him that he was no longer the angry young man who'd stormed off this ranch 2 decades ago, but a middle-aged man who'd spent 20 years learning lessons he could have learned right here at home. "You look like Dad did on Christmas morning," Sarah said, joining him on the porch with her own coffee. Overwhelmed by how much people care, but trying not to show it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Little Bear direct the memorial construction with 8-year-old authority. The boy had processed Thunder's death with the resilience children often show, but Jackson could see the grief in his nephew's careful attention to every detail of the memorial project. "I called the bank yesterday," Sarah said quietly. "Told them about everything, the medical bills, Dad's condition, the ranch finances." Jackson felt his stomach tighten. "And they're willing to work with us." Apparently, Thunder was insured for more than I realized. Dad had taken out a policy years ago, back when Thunder was winning breeding competitions. Between that and the community fundraiser Mrs. Patterson organized, we might actually be able to keep the ranch. The relief in her voice was palpable, but Jackson could hear the exhaustion underneath. Sarah had been carrying the weight of the family's problems alone for too long, trying to manage her father's declining health, raise Little Bear, maintain her veterinary practice, and keep the ranch operational. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I've been thinking about taking early retirement from the ranger service." She turned to look at him with surprise. "Tommy, you can't give up your career for us. You've worked too hard to build your life as Jackson Rivers." "Have I?" Jackson asked, surprising himself with the question. "I spent 20 years running from who I was supposed to be, and for what? So I could live alone in a government apartment and eat dinner from the microwave while my family struggled without me?" The sound of Ezra's voice calling from inside the house interrupted their conversation. Sarah's face immediately creased with concern. Their father had been having more bad days than good since the trauma of Thunder's death, his confusion intensifying under the stress. "I'll go," Jackson said, but Sarah was already moving toward the door. They found Ezra in the living room, staring at a framed photograph of Martha holding a newborn calf. Thunder as a baby, all knobby legs and curious eyes. Ezra's weathered hands trembled as he traced Martha's face in the photograph. "She said Thunder would be special," Ezra murmured, his voice clearer than it had been in days. "The night he was born, during that terrible storm, Martha said he came into the world to teach us something important about love." Jackson knelt beside his father's chair, noting how much older Ezra looked than just 3 days ago. The stress and confusion had aged him visibly, carving new lines around his eyes and bowing his shoulders with invisible weight. "What do you think Thunder taught us, Dad?" Ezra looked at Jackson with sudden clarity, and for a moment his steel-gray eyes held all the wisdom and strength that had defined him as a younger man. "That love ain't always pretty or convenient. Sometimes love means making hard choices. Sometimes it means letting go when holding on would be selfish." The words hit Jackson with unexpected force. He understood suddenly that his father wasn't just talking about Thunder's death, but about Jackson's own departure 20 years ago. Maybe Ezra had understood even then that his headstrong son needed to leave in order to find his own way in the world. "Dad," Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm sorry I stayed away so long." "You came back when we needed you most," Ezra replied with simple dignity. "That's what matters now." Little Bear burst through the front door at that moment, his face flushed with excitement and covered in sawdust. "Grandpa Ezra, Uncle Tommy, come see Thunder's memorial. Mr. Morrison says it's the finest piece of ranch carpentry he's ever seen." They followed the boy outside, Ezra moving slowly but with obvious pride in his grandson's enthusiasm. The memorial was indeed beautiful, a sturdy cedar structure with Thunder's name carved into the front panel and space for flowers or personal mementos. But what took Jackson's breath away was the inscription Little Bear had asked Mr. Morrison to add below Thunder's name. He taught us that love is stronger than letting go. Little Bear, Sarah said, her voice wondering. Where did you learn words like that? The boy looked up at his mother with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess. Thunder told me in my dream last night. He said he wasn't sad about dying because he got to show our family how to love each other again. The adults exchanged glances over Little Bear's head, each processing the profound simplicity of the child's understanding. Thunder's death had indeed brought them together. Jackson home from his self-imposed exile, Sarah's guilt transformed into acceptance, Ezra's confusion momentarily cleared by the certainty of love. Dr. Patricia Fernandez arrived just as they were admiring the completed memorial, carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone with official business to conduct. Jackson felt his stomach tighten, wondering if their legal troubles were far from over despite Sheriff Hayes's assurances. Dr. Whitehorse, she said to Sarah, I have Thunder's official autopsy report, and I wanted to deliver it personally. Sarah accepted the folder with trembling hands, but Dr. Fernandez's next words surprised them all. The cancer was more advanced than your original diagnosis indicated. Based on the tissue samples, Thunder had perhaps 2 weeks left, not the 6 weeks you estimated. The pain medication you'd been administering was no longer effective. His calcium levels and bone density measurements show he was suffering significantly. Jackson watched relief flood his sister's face as the last of her guilt about the timing of her decision finally lifted. Dr. Whitehorse, Dr. Fernandez continued, I want you to know that your decision to end Thunder's suffering when you did was not only medically appropriate, but compassionate. In my official report, I've recommended that this case be used as a model for how to handle end-of-life decisions for large animals in family farming operations. The validation from a state veterinarian meant everything to Sarah, but Jackson could see it meant even more to their father. Ezra straightened his shoulders and looked at his daughter with unmistakable pride. Always knew you had the best heart of any doctor in Montana, he said clearly. Thunder knew it too. As the afternoon wore on and the neighbors began to head home, the Whitehorse family found themselves alone together for the first time in 20 years. They sat on the front porch as the sun set behind the mountains, watching Little Bear play with the barn cats and listening to the familiar sounds of cattle settling for the night. So what happens now? Sarah asked quietly. Jackson looked at his family, his real family, not the colleagues and acquaintances who'd filled his life as Jackson Rivers, and felt something settle into place that had been missing for 2 decades. Now we figure out how to be a family again, he said. Together. In the distance, Thunder's memorial caught the last light of day, standing as a testament to love, sacrifice, and the connections that endure beyond death. The Whitehorse family was together again, scarred but healing, carrying forward the lessons a gentle giant had taught them about the true meaning of coming home. 1 month after Thunder's funeral, the Whispering Pines Ranch buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in years. Jackson, he'd legally changed his name back to Tommy Whitehorse the week before, stood in the kitchen at dawn, making coffee in the same pot his mother had used for 30 years. The familiar ritual of measuring grounds and listening to the percolator's gentle bubbling brought him a peace he'd never found in his ranger station apartment. Outside, Little Bear was already in the barn, feeding the new calf they'd acquired from Caleb Morrison. The boy had named her Courage, explaining to anyone who asked that Thunder had taught him courage wasn't about not being scared, but about doing the right thing even when you were scared. The calf followed Little Bear around with the same devoted attention Thunder had once shown, and watching them together made Tommy's heart ache with gratitude for second chances. Sarah emerged from her father's room, carrying the breakfast tray that had become part of their morning routine. Ezra's Alzheimer's symptoms had stabilized somewhat since the family had reunited, as if having his loved ones close had given his mind something to anchor itself to. His good days were precious, filled with stories about the ranch's history and gentle guidance for Little Bear. His difficult days were manageable now that the burden of care was shared among 3 adults instead of falling entirely on Sarah's shoulders. "How is he this morning?" Tommy asked, pouring his sister a cup of coffee. "Lucid, and asking for pancakes," Sarah replied with a smile. "He wants to walk out to Thunder's memorial after breakfast. Says he has something important to tell Thunder about the ranch's future." The ranch's future had been the subject of many family discussions over the past month. The insurance money from Thunder's policy, combined with the overwhelming community support and Sarah's growing veterinary practice, had stabilized their finances. But more importantly, they'd discovered that the ranch could support multiple generations working together toward common goals. Tommy had submitted his resignation to the Montana Park Service, citing personal reasons and the need to care for an aging parent. His supervisor, who'd worked with Jackson Rivers for 15 years, had been surprised but ultimately understanding. "Family first," Captain Morrison had said. "That's a value we can all respect." The decision to leave his ranger career hadn't been difficult once Tommy understood what he'd be gaining in return. 20 years of professional accomplishments paled in comparison to the simple joy of eating breakfast with his nephew, helping his father with physical therapy exercises, and working alongside his sister to build something lasting. Dr. Patricia Fernandez had become a regular visitor to the ranch, ostensibly to check on the livestock, but really to document the family's innovative approach to multi-generational ranch management. She was particularly interested in how they'd integrated Sarah's veterinary expertise with traditional ranching practices and Tommy's wildlife management background. "You're creating a model that other ranching families could follow," she'd told them during her most recent visit. "Combining modern medical knowledge with traditional animal husbandry, supported by wildlife conservation principles. It's exactly what Montana agriculture needs for the next century." The praise was gratifying, but Tommy was more moved by smaller victories. Yesterday, Little Bear had successfully delivered a presentation to his 4th grade class about how my family takes care of animals, complete with photographs of Thunder's memorial and drawings of courage, learning to trust humans. The teacher had called Sarah afterward to say it was the most mature and thoughtful presentation she'd heard from a student that age. Ezra shuffled into the kitchen at that moment, moving slowly but steadily with his walker. His steel-gray eyes were bright and focused, indicating this would be one of his good days. "Morning, son," he said to Tommy, the greeting carrying weight that had been absent during Tommy's years as Jackson Rivers. "Morning, sweetheart," he added to Sarah, accepting his coffee with hands that trembled only slightly. "Dad, you said you wanted to visit Thunder's memorial this morning," Sarah reminded him gently. "What's so important that it couldn't wait?" Ezra's face took on the expression of a man who'd made a significant decision. "I've been thinking about what happens to this ranch when I'm gone. With my mind the way it is, we need to make plans while I can still think clearly." Tommy felt his stomach tighten. They'd all been avoiding discussions about Ezra's long-term prognosis, focusing instead on making each day as good as possible. "Dad, you're not going anywhere anytime soon," Sarah said firmly. "The doctor said your condition is stable, and with all of us here to help—" "Sarah, honey, I'm not talking about dying tomorrow," Ezra interrupted with gentle patience. "But I am 75 years old with Alzheimer's disease. We need to face reality while I'm still competent to make legal decisions." Little Bear appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment, his hair still messy from sleep, but his eyes bright with the energy that defined 8-year-olds everywhere. Grandpa Ezra, are we going to visit Thunder now? I made him a picture of courage so he'll know we got a new baby cow. The innocence of the child's request provided a natural bridge to the conversation Ezra wanted to have. They walked together to Thunder's memorial, Little Bear chattering about Courage's progress, while the adults processed the weight of decisions that needed to be made. Thunder's gravesite had become a place of peace for the family. The cedar memorial weathered beautifully, and Sarah had planted wildflowers around its base that bloomed in rotation throughout the growing season. Little Bear had added a collection of interesting rocks and a small American flag, creating a shrine that reflected both reverence and childlike creativity. Thunder, Ezra said, settling onto the bench Tommy had built facing the memorial. I brought the family here because you need to hear this too. He looked around at his children and grandson, his expression serious but not sad. I've been to the lawyer in town, and I've had all the papers drawn up. The ranch is going into a family trust, with Tommy and Sarah as co-trustees, and Little Bear as the eventual inheritor. Sarah started to protest, but Ezra held up his hand. Let me finish. The trust is structured so that no single person has to carry the full burden of this place. Tommy, your wildlife expertise and government connections will help us navigate environmental regulations. Sarah, your veterinary practice can operate from the ranch, providing income and serving the community. Little Bear will grow up understanding that this land is his responsibility to future generations. Tommy felt emotions he couldn't name rising in his chest. His father was essentially forgiving 20 years of absence and trusting him with the family legacy he'd once rejected. Dad, are you sure? I walked away from this place once. What makes you think I won't do it again? Ezra's laugh was rich with warmth and understanding. Son, you didn't walk away from the ranch. You walked away from being told who you had to be. Now you're choosing to come back as the man you became. That's different. Little Bear climbed onto the bench beside his grandfather, his small hand finding Ezra's weathered one. Grandpa, does this mean Uncle Tommy is staying forever? Forever's a long time, little man, Ezra replied, but it means he's staying for as long as our family needs him, and this family's always going to need him. The legal and practical details would take months to finalize, but the emotional foundation was laid that morning beside Thunder's grave. They were no longer three separate people struggling with individual problems, but a family committed to facing whatever came together. As they walked back to the house, Tommy realized that Thunder's final gift hadn't been bringing them together for a crisis, but teaching them that love sometimes requires letting go of old hurts and old patterns in order to build something new and stronger. The ranch would survive, not because any individual was strong enough to carry it alone, but because they'd learned to share both the burdens and the joys of the life they were building together. Thunder had shown them the way home to each other, and now it was up to them to make that homecoming permanent. In the distance, Courage mooed softly from her pasture, a sound full of promise for the future. This story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances or coming home to what truly matters. Like Tommy Whitehorse, many of us have spent years building careers and identities that, while successful, left us feeling disconnected from our deepest values and relationships. The beauty of this later season of life is that we finally have the wisdom to recognize what deserves our time and energy, and the courage to make difficult changes. Whether it's reconnecting with estranged family members, moving closer to grandchildren, or simply slowing down enough to appreciate the daily blessings we've been rushing past, we all have opportunities for meaningful homecomings. Thunder's story shows us that love isn't just about the good times, it's about showing up when things get difficult, messy, and complicated. The ranch represents something many of us long for, a place where multiple generations work together, where experience is valued, and where every family member has both something to contribute and something to receive. Sometimes the very challenges that seem like endings, illness, financial pressure, family conflict, can become the catalyst for the deeper connections we've been seeking all along. Discussion questions. What thunder in your life taught you the most important lesson about loyalty and love? If you could go back and have one conversation with a family member you've lost touch with, what would you want to say? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what another reader needs to hear today.